Hello everyone and welcome back to NovaLogos Audio English. We have reached the final chapter of Part 3. Throughout this series we have discussed value, responsibility, and the shrewd use of resources. But today, we address the most important resource of all, the posture of our heart before God. We are exploring the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. This parable is a masterclass in contrast. It shows two men praying in the same temple but leaving with completely different results. One man is full of his own virtues, while the other is full of his own need for mercy. It teaches us that in the kingdom of heaven, the way up is down. Let's explore the language of prayer, justification, and radical humility. Section 1. The narrative of two prayers. Let's listen to the narrative from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Listen carefully to the difference in their focus. One looks at his achievements, the other looks at his sins. Jesus then addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two people went up to the temple area to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a tax collector. The Pharisee took up his station and spoke this prayer to himself, "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance, and would not even raise his eyes to heaven but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, not the former. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Section 2. Vocabulary Deep Dive. Righteousness and Mercy. The vocabulary here highlights the difference between external religious performance and internal spiritual reality. First, the word convinced. To be convinced means to be completely certain about something. In this context, it describes a dangerous certainty. The Pharisee was convinced of his own righteousness. He left no room for God's grace because he thought he had already earned it. Second, the verb despised. To despise means to feel a deep contempt or a strong dislike for someone. The Pharisee didn't just feel better than others, he despised them. True righteousness never leads to despising others, only self-righteousness does. Third, the term tithes. A tithe is a 10th part of one's annual income given as an offering to the church. The Pharisee was proud of his strict obedience to this religious law. Fourth, the phrase, beat his breast. This is a physical gesture of deep sorrow, repentance, and mourning. It shows that the tax collector's prayer wasn't just words. It was a physical cry for help from the depths of his soul. Finally, the word justified. In a spiritual sense, to be justified means to be made right with God. Jesus tells us that only the humble man went home justified. Section 3. Symbolic Wisdom. The Wall of Pride versus the Door of Mercy. This parable reveals the mechanics of how prayer reaches God. First, let's analyze the prayer of I. If you listen to the Pharisee, his prayer is essentially a list of his own accomplishments. He uses God as a mirror to admire himself. He isn't actually praying to God. The text says he prayed to himself. Pride creates a wall that even prayer cannot cross. He was so full of himself that there was no room for God to give him anything. Second, notice the power of distance and posture. The tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes. This wasn't because he was afraid of God, but because he had a true sense of God's holiness compared to his own brokenness. His physical posture, bowed head and beating his breast, opened a door. While the Pharisee built a wall of merit, the tax collector opened a door of misery for God's mercy to enter. Finally, we see the great paradox of exaltation. Jesus concludes with a rule that governs the entire spiritual life. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. In the world, we climb by stepping on others. In the kingdom, we rise by recognizing our need for help. The tax collector received everything because he admitted he had nothing. Section 4. Advanced Language Pattern. Not even. For emphasis. The narrator says, "He would not even raise his eyes to heaven." The phrase, "not even," is used to emphasize that something very basic or expected did not happen. It highlights the extreme nature of a situation. He was so tired that he could not even finish his dinner. The problem was so difficult that not even the teacher could solve it. I was so nervous that I could not even remember my own name. Using "not even" allows you to point out the minimum level of an action, showing the intensity of the emotion or the difficulty of the task. Section 5. Practical Application. Practicing Temple Humility. How do we apply the Pharisee and the tax collector to our daily life and our English studies? First, beware of learning pride. As you get better at English, it's easy to look down on those who are just starting. Don't be the Pharisee of grammar. Instead, remember how much you have received and be a source of encouragement for others. Second, pray with tax collector honesty. In your spiritual life, don't try to impress God with your purple garments or tithes. Come to Him with your real struggles. The shortest prayer in the Bible, "O God, be merciful to me a sinner," is the one that was heard the loudest. Third, value the process over the performance. The Pharisee was focused on the performance of religion. The tax collector was focused on the process of healing. In your studies and your life, focus on being justified and made new every day, rather than just looking perfect to others. Consolidation and review. Deepening your understanding. Let's review the key phrases that show us the path to a humble and justified heart, convinced of their own righteousness. This describes a closed heart. Righteousness here refers to a state of being morally perfect in one's own eyes. When you are convinced of your own perfection, you stop growing because you feel you have arrived. It is the death of a student's heart and a disciple's soul. Despised everyone else, a direct result of self-righteousness. Despise is a very strong verb in English, implying that you view others as worthless. This phrase warns us that the moment we think we are better than others, we lose the capacity to love them. Standing off at a distance. This phrase illustrates the holy fear or deep respect the tax collector felt. It wasn't about being far from God's love, but about recognizing the vast difference between human sin and divine holiness. It is the beginning of true wisdom, would not even raise his eyes. This is a beautiful image of shame turned into grace. By not raising his eyes, he was acknowledging his unworthiness. In English, we use not even to show that his humility was so deep, it affected his most basic physical movements. Be merciful to me, a sinner. The golden prayer. The word merciful comes from a Greek root that refers to propitiation, or making things right. He wasn't asking for a reward. He was asking for a fresh start. This is the only prayer that can empty a heart of pride. Went home justified. The legal and spiritual victory. Justified means to be declared, not guilty. The irony is that the good man stayed in his guilt, while the bad man was set free simply because of his humility. Exalts himself versus humbles himself. These are the two directions of life. To exalt, raise up, oneself is a temporary human action. To be exalted, raised up by God, is an eternal divine action. True promotion comes from God, and it starts on our knees. Thank you for joining us for Chapter 15 and for completing Part 3. Today we learned that the gate to heaven is low, and only those who are willing to bow can enter. Let us carry this tax collector's heart into everything we do, our prayers, our relationships, and our studies. If this lesson on humility touched your heart, please like and subscribe. This concludes our journey through Part 3, the path of discipleship. In Part 4, watchfulness and final judgment, we will begin Chapter 16 with the parable of the two sons, exploring the difference between saying yes and actually doing it. Until then, stay humble and stay blessed. Goodbye.